My name is Brenda McLeod. I have lived in the Pemberton Valley since 1962, and my family has owned land since the 1950s, when land was reclaimed by the P.F.R.A. for farming. I have been involved in the Pemberton Valley Dyking District as chair and as a director and trustee for a number of years, and I'm passionate about the Pemberton Valley, farming, and keeping our people in the valley safe from flooding. So today I'm going to talk about flooding in past years. Flooding and how it was combated. Dividing the Coast Mountains from the Cascades, the Lillooet River is a trough gouged out by glaciers and originating in a vast glacier itself. The Lillooet River meanders along the flat valley floor for miles, swinging freely from one side to the other until restrictive man-made dikes regulate its flow and curb its wandering. Then, about 60 miles from its source, the river enters Lillooet Lake, passes through, and speeds south to the Harrison system. Over the thousands and thousands of years of the flooding river has repeatedly laid down rich layers of sediments over the debris left by the glaciers. Rivers and streams, most of them glacier-fed, have strongly influenced the lives of all who lived in the area. For unrecorded time, waters moving through the valleys have provided fish for food, and from unrecorded time, the rivers have carried sediments which have created the richness of this fertile farmland. And through recorded time, rivers have certainly continued to flood these farmlands, though since the flood control program of 1945 to 1951, the Lillooet has carried away a greatly increased load of sediments. In the summer of 1972, geographers from many parts of the world climbed the hill overlooking the north end of Lillooet Lake to look down on the massive deposits from the streams which form the Lillooet River. In 1901, Carl A. Hartzell wrote to the Daily Province stating that 20,000 acres of Pemberton land were out of reach of flood, and that an acre in the dry sections could produce 1,500 pounds of grain or 12 tons of potatoes. Appearing in the same paper as Hartzell's letter was one from Charles Barber, who lamented that the government's lack of foresight in failing to build a road from the coast to Pemberton prevented annual production of $1 million worth of agricultural products. Some selling at $18 an acre, Pemberton land was cheaper than Fraser Valley land, which in the 1900s sold at an average of $45 an acre. Charles Barber settled on the land, which he had bought some years earlier from Pettit. In May 1906, after 3.5 days on the trail from Squamish, Barber and his wife Dora and their 2 children reached Pemberton. While he was building their log house, the family lived for a few days in the old part of the store, and that summer Pemberton experienced such a serious flood that the whole place was like a river. Barber's stepdaughter, B.B. Fowles Ruddock, recalls that one of the worst spells of mosquitoes followed the flood, and that her stepfather would fling open the door, then quickly close it. Between the opening and the closing, he would throw in an armful of wood. About the time the Dermody family and Spetch family settled, a number of single men were arriving. In 1905, Robert Hutchison preempted 160 acres in the upper reaches of the valley, where successive floods silted his cabin to the windowsills and buried his abandoned sewing machine. As a surveyor for the provincial government, G.M. Doughton knew the Pemberton area, and in 1913, his conclusion regarding its future was that with a railway to the coast and flood protection, the agricultural possibilities of the Lillooet River Valley could hardly be overestimated. He stressed the assets of rapid spring growth from unfrozen ground and an average land clearing cost that was comparatively low at $50 an acre. With railway construction proceeding and flood protection under discussion, Doughton's prediction of profits, front garden produce, and small fruits seemed realizable. Jack Ronayne, too, forecast success with fruits, and even then felt that potatoes would be writ large in the future history of the valley. Settlers began to ask for government help with the flooding problems. In February 1911, Ray Elliott and Jack Nelson, a surveyor, circulated a petition asking for Victoria's help with drainage. In May 1912, the Daily Province carried this item. Property owners in Pemberton Meadows are petitioning the provincial government to appoint a commission for carrying out of a project for draining 15,000 acres. A few months later, Ernest McBride, a superintendent of roads, said that $10,000 spent on blasting out obstructions in the river above Lillooet Lake would save Pemberton from flooding. Cleveland and Cameron of the Howe Sound and Northern's Railway Survey prepared a report which was to be consulted much later during the reclamation of the valley. Some early settlers lived to see that reclamation, but in the years of waiting, they saw family after family sadly give up the struggle with the water environment and move elsewhere. In 1924, an English immigrant wrote home to England from Squamish. Pemberton is not much of a place from what I hear. It is infested with mosquitoes and floods, and the market is awkward. The rye charges are very high. The Great Flood. The Lillooet River and its tributaries are quiet and shallow in the wintertime, but turn into raging torrents when fed by melting snows and glaciers during the summer months. Flooding has always been a problem in the Pemberton area, some years much more than others. By 1940, some rather inadequate dikes helped to keep the river within its boundaries, especially where there were sharp bends. Seepage from the river helped to supply underground irrigation for growing crops, and therefore any slight flooding was a curse on the low ground, though it actually improved the harvest on the higher fields. In the fall of 1940, early cool weather in September had whitened the mountain tops with the first of the winter snow. In the bright sunshine of the first 2 weeks of October, the potatoes were harvested, and on many farms already pitted or in root houses ready for the winter. Then on October 15th, the weather unaccountably warmed up. It started to rain and rain and rain, 5 inches in 24 hours. The warm rain on the mountains brought the melting snow rushing down the Lillooet River and its tributaries, notably Ryan Creek, which emerges from the mountains back on the Ross farm and runs down the west side of the valley to join the Lillooet north of Morgan Miller's farm. At the north end of the valley, on a partially cleared farm, lived Lukey Van Beem and his wife Doris. A Dutchman raised in Java, Lukey had come to Pemberton in 1924. Doris, a native-born Canadian who spent her early days in Vancouver, recalls her experiences during the flood. We went to bed listening to the rain pouring steadily on the shake roof and drifted off to sleep. Sometime later, I awoke with a start at the noise of something hitting the side of the house and heard a steady sound of water running. We both arose quickly, and even in the pitch black, we saw the water was all around us and roaring through the slough. A fallen tree was riding the water and had bumped into the chicken house behind our cabin and over the edge of the slough. Still, the rain poured down, and I could see Lukey's concern. He dressed as best he could against the elements and went to investigate. Imagine my fear when he went across that log. All so far was dry at the barn. It was as high as the house, but he could determine that before long everything might be inundated. I was glad to see him back. He decided, since he had no boat and might have to leave, that he should make a raft. I managed to give him a little something to eat while it was still dark, and then he found enough odds and ends to start building. By now, it was around 6 in the morning and the water was coming up to the knoll. Lukey went back to the barn and put a plank up to the mow so that the cow and calf could be driven up there. He also put a board up in the hen house and last of all turned the horses loose. By this time, the log was almost underwater. So I was relieved to see him back at the cabin. I had just put what I could up off the floor. When my husband had finished the raft, he took a fencing tool in his pocket as the water was coming close to the floor of the house, said, "I think we had better head down to Wilson's." Betty Wilson, too, had first come to the valley as a visitor. She came to the Deckers in May and married Ed Wilson that same summer. Their house was on fairly high ground, about 2 miles away. We set sail. My heart was beating loudly, I'm sure. I'm not a courageous person, but I calmed a little when we seemed to be floating quite well, and every time Lukey came to a fence, he snipped the wire with his fencing tool, holding us at the fence post while he did so. We finally came to Jim Bartow's place. He also was high and dry. When he invited us in there, I was hesitant. About 50 cats and chickens were running in and out of the house, so Lukey declined his offer. It wasn't too far to the Wilsons' farm from there, and we were getting close to the road. We kept on, and soon we reached it. We thought we were doing very well when suddenly we came to a place where the river dike had broken and the water pouring in from 2 directions caused a strong whirling current. The raft rammed a fence post and we upended. Down I went. The water was icy cold and I couldn't seem to hit bottom or rise up. Suddenly I was being pulled up and held by my dear husband. He swam with me to a shallower spot, and I was very thankful to be able to walk in the water waist high. We knew it was the road we were walking on and kept on towards Wilson's. At times a hole gouged by the water would be too deep for me, so Lukey swam with me, then it would be shallower again. At last we came to Ed Wilson's gate, and there they were on the porch looking for us. They felt that we would try to come. The Wilsons already had John Jack with them and an old timer who lived in a shack nearby, and we all enjoyed very hot coffee and pancakes together and Thanksgiving for our blessings. That same evening the rain let up some, but continued through the night. The next morning the sun was shining and casting pictures on the still flowing water. The water went down very quickly, and by afternoon Lukey insisted that he go home to see the situation there. He had to pick his way as he walked off, and I worried all the time he was gone. He found the cow and the calf safely in the mow, the chickens all on top of their house. He cleaned the silt from our house as best he could and then came back to the Wilsons. The next day, Ed loaned us a horse and we rode home on it together. Everything still very mucky. Luckily, none of our belongings were ruined, but some other people were not so fortunate. Morgan's father, William Miller, wrote to his sister Nell on November 11th, 1940. We had a very fine summer in Pemberton, the best crops we ever had, no overflow from the river. A coyote took a few of our chickens and the climbing cutworms did a little damage to our potatoes. That was all the trouble we had until the 18th of October when it rained for about 3 days. The water came up 4 foot higher than we had ever seen it. It got so deep and swift that 11 head of our cattle drowned, also 9 hogs and 10 colonies of bees. Some people up the valley nearly got drowned. Our hay got wet as there were about 3 feet of water in the hay mows. Robbie and I had about half our turnips pulled, piled and covered with their tops. They all went. Our potatoes are here yet in the root houses, but so muddy that they are starting to rot in the bottom of the pile. The flood set us back at least $1,000. I only mention our loss, but some people are probably worse off. Morgan's muskrat crop is gone. he will lose $1,000 worth of rats, as well as potatoes and hay, and maybe some turnips. Alf Ridley, who lives 1.5 miles above us, lost 8 of his 11 cows and all his hogs. The natives must have lost most of their cattle, hogs, and potatoes. We left a boat tied to the house, as it might easily have kept on raining for a week instead of 3 days. Our 4 horses came through all right. They stood on the highest land until the water went down. If the cattle had done that, none would have drowned. Instead, they keep running up and down the road, getting into deep holes and getting stuck on the barbed wire fences. Our troubles are not over yet. We have clear 0 weather now, so our potatoes and turnips may freeze. In 1940, most of the population lived in the upper valley of the Pemberton Meadows, but there were a few farms below Miller Creek. The Gimses on the Barber Place, about 2 miles south of Miller Creek, had just finished harvesting a record crop of potatoes, about 60 tons, says Gunnar Gibbs, now a resident of Birkin. The potatoes were lying in piles around the field, ready to be covered in preparation for the winter's cold. Very little of that fine crop was ever recovered. As the flood receded, the story was the same everywhere. Cows, calves, pigs, and chickens found drowned, farm machinery covered in silt, crops ruined. The next year, the grass was very poor, huge logs had to be removed from the fields, and livestock losses were heavy. And the people had received no flood relief, little publicity, and only a little seed grain supplied by the government. All the housewives mentioned the terrible cleanup job, but one bachelor solved the problem quite happily. He made trails through the dirt, for all the world like trails through a snow-laden field. After the flooding, the Pemberton farmers struggled to get on their feet again. The only government help offered was seed to plant the following year. Nothing for ruined homes, drowned stock, spoiled machinery, and lost tools. Nothing even for stored crops, ruined and unsaleable. Farmers and businessmen all realized that some effort had to be made to prevent the reoccurrence of such a disaster. The Pemberton Drainage and Reclamation Committee, formed by the Board of Trade, supported by the Farmers Institute, consisted of Bob Taylor, Joe Tellifer, and Harold Wyatt Purden. And their main purpose was to prepare a brief to be presented to the Post-War Rehabilitation Council. The brief called for the diking and straightening of the Lillooet River and its tributaries, Ryan Creek, Miller Creek, and the lowering of Lillooet Lake. The chairman of the Post-War Rehabilitation Council, the Honorable H.G.T. Perry, was present at a hearing on flood control held in Pemberton on October 2nd, 1942, and the Farmers Institute sent Nels Fraser and Ernest Cooper as its representatives. Apart from appealing to every branch of the provincial and federal governments which might conceivably be willing to help, the Drainage Committee was active in the field. The committee by this time also included Sandy Ross, Morgan Miller, Ron Ronayne, Eddie Ronayne, and Walter Green. They completed the Miller Cut thanks to $275 subscribed locally and to a donation of powder from the provincial government. Most of the labor for this project was donated. Finally, in 1946, the efforts of the committee were rewarded and the federal government agreed to carry out the reclamation project under the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Act, ironically passed to deal with drought conditions. Besides diking and straightening the rivers and making certain alterations to the channel between Lillooet Lake and Tenace Lake, the project had the eventual effect of lowering the water of the Lillooet River by some 15 feet and ditches constructed in strategic areas to run off surplus water brought large blocks of former swampland into production. The Pemberton Valley Diking Commission was officially formed in 1947, and the letters patent show the first committee as Sandy Ross, Morgan Miller, Bob Taylor, Harold Wyatt Purden, and Ronald Ronayne. Joseph Tellifer acted as the first returning officer. Not only were existing land holdings improved, but much reclaimed Crown land became available for settlement, notably the area between Pemberton and Mount Currie, a large section above Miller Creek, and a block of land in the northern part of the valley near the Wolverine Cut. All this was not accomplished without some tribulations. Land for ditches at times taken from those who stood little to gain from the works. Residents were awakened at early hours by the window-rattling blasts set by Sandy Ross. Local men and government engineers did not always agree on methods. Taxes were levied before completion with predictable protests. Worst of all, in July 1948, high water caused flooding when the drainage project was but half completed. The farms in the upper valley were safe behind dikes, but the floodwaters swept on to inundate the lower valley farms of Bert Lundgren, Morgan Miller, Slim Fougberg, Andy Anderson, Henry Menzel, Fred Menzel, and Vivian Locken. The project was finally completed, however, and taken over by the local committee with power to levy taxes and generally maintain the dikes. Under the tripartite agreement signed in 1948, the federal government did the construction. The provincial government provided access roads and rights of way, and the local committee accepted responsibility for general maintenance. A dragline was purchased for ditch clearing, and Morgan Miller became foreman of works. Over the next 10 years, the water level of the Lillooet River gradually dropped, and some farmers who in the pre-drainage era had been safe on the high land were faced with the necessity of buying irrigation equipment. Drying out became more of a problem than flooding, and higher taxes forced farmers to press all their land into production. By the mid-60s, irrigation pipes were a standard feature on most potato-producing farms. The new land made available by the drainage project brought a rush of new settlers in the late 40s and early 50s. New modern services like electricity and telephones also encouraged the purchase of both old, rundown farms and the new government land.
I don't think their chickens in their little outbuilding fared so well. So that's not a happy homecoming. Homes and farms were rendered tiny islands in a sea of water. Only things taken to high ground were saved, like this Highways Department equipment. The BC rail line will be closed indefinitely. The company hasn't even considered how to clean up this mess. Some hunters and campers were marooned by major washouts north of Pemberton. Some had been stuck for days. The boat is the most useful mode of travel in the Pemberton Meadow area. These houses have been floated off their foundations by the rising water. For many, this was their first time home in 24 hours, and some had driven their vehicles away. A new housing subdivision with houses built higher than the others to avoid flooding is also hard hit. Some families had moved whatever they could to upper stories in their houses, and now they're worried about flooding there.
And a tractor. Yeah. What about your chickens here? Have you had a look at that? They're gone, I'm sure. Yeah. Well,
the owners of some of these homes feel the flooding has been largely unnecessary, and the damage could have been limited if the authorities had acted quickly enough.
Floodwaters here are higher than they were yesterday. The dikes, which were supposed to withstand the highest waters ever recorded, have broken in more than 10 places. And disaster coordinators estimate that more than 190 homes are underwater. In some places, only the roofs are showing. 50 more homes are threatened by floodwaters, which continue to rise.
The loss, to their personal possessions, their crops, their animals.
Any idea what this is going to be costing you?
Millions. Last time I did millions and millions, and I would say millions and millions and millions. There's no way I can estimate now.
Few residents were able to get to their homes, which they had abandoned last night. This truck barely made it over this river, which was once a road.